Back with us on the SportsMax Zone. So good to have you on this Monday. Delegates of the Grenada Football Association, GFA, last Saturday elected former FIFA regional manager and attorney at law Malon Glean as their new president. In elections held at the Kirani James Athletics Stadium conference room and observed by officials from FIFA and CONCACAF, Glean unseated the incumbent Chenny Joseph by 13 votes to 8. Only one member of the previous executive, Randy Campbell, managed to win a place on the new leadership team. Campbell, who previously served as parish director, is now second vice president. This is how the new executive looks. So Malon Glean at the head of affairs, first vice president Carl Andal, a second vice president Randy Campbell, parish director for St. Andrew, Ricky Aberdeen, director for St. Patrick, Ricky Williams, the director for St. David, Ken Martin Whiteman, director for St. Mark, Arco Mark, St. John, Raleigh Duncan, for St. George, Lyndon Bub, for Carriacou and Petit Martinique, Dwayne Williams, and the female member is Kazira Thomas. So we made several efforts today to get to Malon Glean, but you would imagine that it is a busy day for him as he gets about the task of putting the Grenada Football Association's house in order and to roll out on the manifesto promises he would have made. Lance, it is a turn-up for the books, as we would say in sporting circles, because from many people's perspective, Chenny Joseph was the favourite to win, especially given that the benefit of incumbency gives you charge not of the election machine, because it suggests that it would be suggest fraud, and we're not imputing that on Mr. Joseph. Yeah. But when you're in office, there are certain things you can control that will put you somewhat at an advantage relative to someone who's outside trying to get in. And we did hear Malon Glean speak last Thursday about not seeing the delegates list up to the time he was doing this interview, which was Thursday evening late. Despite all those things, he won a clear victory and is now set to take charge of the GFA.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, there was still a lot of support for Chenny Joseph. Mathematically, I think the 13-8 vote in favour of Glean suggests that percentage-wise, Chenny Joseph had about 38 to 39% of the votes. So he still had his support. And I think Glean, when he spoke with us pre-election, George, he did concede that at the outset Chenny Joseph had done a favourable job as president. He just felt that as time wore on, his effectiveness and his vision had sort of been diluted and there was a need for a change. And obviously he had the support of the delegates, so he's now in charge. Comes with good acumen as a former FIFA regional development officer. And in talking to him, we got a sense that he looks passionate and looks business-like, and I think Grenada is in for a good period under his guidance.
Yeah, you know, the thing is this, coming out of COVID and the suspension to football-related activities over that time, well, suspension of everything, it's not as if football alone fell victim, but I get the sense that incumbents are under a peculiar kind of pressure because there has been so much time that has passed and so much that has not happened in that time has passed. And yet, they would have been spending money on certain things. So when people try to reconcile, well, you've been spending money on this and that, but we haven't been playing much football, and there hasn't been much local activity in terms of organized football, because you and I know very well, it's only in a handful of CARICOM states and CFU states that football has been played in, even up to this point in the pandemic, and we're still in it. So they have a particularly difficult sell to delegates to say, well, give me another vote of confidence at an election for me to continue my mandate, because people say, well, continue which mandate? It's been stalled, nothing has been happening. So I think that gives challenges a particular advantage. But Chenny Joseph would have been crushed that his streak ends at 3 because he was looking for the 4th timer, but the people said no.
Yeah, and I saw him in an interview prior to the election, Chenny Joseph, talking about the rich history of leadership that Grenada had based on, well, the 2 presidents before him, Ashley Ram Folks and Dr. Elliot Maguire, who had done a pretty solid job. And Glean did mention in our interview that Grenadians are disappointed about the drop that they have experienced in recent decades, because he did point quite accurately to their 1989 Shell Caribbean Cup.
Second place finish
to Trinidad and Tobago. No, that was the TNT strike squad with Latapi and York and so on that almost qualified for the World Cup in 1990, except for that Paul Caligiuri's strike in Port of Spain that knocked them out. And that Grenada team was a pretty strong team. In fact, Chenny Joseph was on that team.
Yes.
I think Chenny Joseph scored one of the goals in the quarterfinals that beat St. Vincent and the Grenadines. And they had players like Franklin Drayton and Steve Mark, who was actually the MVP for that tournament. A very solid defender, holding midfielder, Steve Mark, dreadlocked, now deceased. Was very, very impressed with him, George. So he got the MVP for a tournament that TNT won, and TNT had Latapi and York. York actually scored twice in the final to beat Grenada. So it just tells you that in 1989, Grenada was a strong force in regional football. Now they're not in the top 10 in the Caribbean. Their world ranking is, I think, 170th, which based on the FIFA listing puts them out of the Caribbean top 10.
Yeah.
They're ranked 11th. So Grenadians aren't going to be satisfied with that. I heard Chenny Joseph mentioning that under his governance, Grenada had qualified twice for the Gold Cup, which is commendable. So I think Glean recognizes that the appetite for success in football in Grenada is pretty high. And while they have declined in the past decade or so, he understands that there's a big job in front of him to get Grenada back on track, because they have been derailed if you look at what they have accomplished in recent years.
But yeah, but you know, as we look at the executive once again, and as we remind you, only one name there was a part of the previous executive. That's the second Vice President, Randy Campbell, who was one of the 6 parish directors. Well, 7, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 parish directors. He's now a second VP. So he's the only man from the old executive who was a part of this new team. At some point, though, delegates will say, look, we are not into dynasty building. And Chenny Joseph, 3 consecutive terms, looking for a 4th. It would have been a dynasty. Well, it is already. Of 3 consecutive terms, it is somewhat of a dynasty. 4 definitely would have qualified it as such. And people would ask the question, well, for the 3 consecutive terms that you were in there, and for what you achieved, is that all that we should reasonably have expected you to accomplish? Must we be satisfied with you holding up the fact that the team qualified for 2 CONCACAF Gold Cups under your charge? What about the other years when we missed out? What about the other things that you would have done? One of the things I like about what Malon Glean did, he, unlike many people who are challenging for office and trying to unseat an incumbent, didn't go the route of making a casting any aspersions about financial misappropriation or anything like that. He kept it on the straight and say, look, it's only on the football that this man has fallen short, because that's not to say that other people who challenge and raise issues of financial impropriety are making mischief, because it could very well be that that is part of the situation, and there's a certain football association in the Caribbean. We're looking at you. Anyway, I liked the campaign that he ran, and I appreciated the fact that he took the time to come and roll out why it is that he wanted to get this big job. I also appreciate the fact that he, as you said, was gracious to recognize that it was not all doom and gloom under Chenny Joseph. Yes. And he said, when I asked him about the ideas that he wanted to implement if he didn't put these to Chenny Joseph, he said, well, George, it's not a situation where I kept them to myself as an advisor or as someone with his ear. I have been telling him about these things cycle after cycle, year after year, and he has ignored me. So the fact of the matter is, Glean has stepped forward wanting to be that man to implement these things, because Joseph perhaps got comfortable in the chair, didn't want to listen to any ideas but his own, and paid the price at the polls. Yeah.
Finally, before we wrap the segment, George, one of the issues surrounding Chenny Joseph going for a 4th term is something that the last CFU Congress that I attended, the issue of term limits had been on the table. And there are some who agree with term limits, others that don't. The argument against term limits in small nations like the Caribbean, I found when I listened to some of the contributors, that because of the critical mass, the small population of
rubbish,
a lot of our, we have to understand that sometimes when we have a good leader, there aren't many of them that you can find, and they don't agree with term limits because we're not awash in the Caribbean with good leaders, and that is one of the arguments they use to support ignoring term limits. And if someone wants to be president for 20 years, and it's clear that they are the best person for the job, they should be allowed.
Rubbish, absolute rubbish. And then your association becomes hostage to personality. You have a dynasty setting in, and someone so comfortable that they brook no other opinion but their own, and they believe that they, at all times, are the brightest persons in the room, and they know everything about everything that is to be known about. Danger, danger, danger. We break, we come back with more right here on the SportsMax Zone. Thank you for watching SportsMax on YouTube. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and to click the notification bell to stay informed.